remember that night as if it happened yesterday, though 15 years have passed. The air in the house was thick, suffocating, the kind of tension that makes every breath feel borrowed. I had been careful for so long, keeping the one thing I knew my father would never accept buried deep inside me. I thought it would stay hidden forever, but that evening, a careless conversation, a look, a word, something had triggered him. His face contorted with fury, eyes blazing, voice shaking the walls. "How could you keep this from me?" he shouted, throwing the accusation like a hammer. I tried to explain, stammering, but the words stuck in my throat, helpless against the storm of his anger. My mother stood frozen, clutching the table, unsure whether to intervene or shrink into the shadows. I felt the ground beneath me shift, a sickening realization that my life as I knew it had ended. In less than 5 minutes, I went from being a part of my family to being disposable, unwanted, exiled. The key to the front door landed with a clang on the floor, a final punctuation mark to my father's wrath. I wanted to argue, to reason, but the fear gripping me made me silent. I walked to the door, each step heavier than the last, and for the first time, I felt utterly alone. The secret that had seemed harmless to me now had the power to annihilate the life I had known, and there was no turning back. I didn't even glance back as the door closed behind me, sealing me out and sealing away any illusion of safety I had ever held. Outside, the cold night wrapped around me, sharp and unforgiving, echoing the emptiness that had suddenly replaced my home. I shivered, but not just from the chill. The betrayal, the shock, the fear, and the uncertainty of what would come next pressed down harder than any winter wind. For the first time in my life, I was truly on my own. The first few weeks after being thrown out felt like wandering through a fog I couldn't escape. Every step I took was heavy with uncertainty, and every night I lay on the cold floor of a friend's couch, listening to the muffled sounds of life I no longer belonged to. I had no money, no stability, and no one to turn to, not really. Pride kept me from asking for help from people who might have judged me, and I quickly learned how cruel the world could feel when you were invisible. I took odd jobs, menial work that barely paid for food, and each task left me exhausted, humiliated, and painfully aware of how much I had sacrificed for a family that had discarded me. People looked at me with pity or indifference, and every slight glance reminded me that I didn't matter in anyone's life. Nights were the worst. Loneliness pressed in like a vice, and memories of laughter and warmth from a home I had lost haunted me relentlessly. I often wondered if my father even cared that I was out there, struggling to survive. It felt unfair, bitter, and unrelenting. Yet, amidst the hunger, the cold, and the quiet tears, a stubborn ember of determination began to flicker inside me. I realized that no one was going to save me, and if I wanted any semblance of dignity, I had to fight for it myself. Every day was a battle, every moment a lesson in endurance, and slowly, painfully, I began to discover the resilience that had been buried beneath fear and betrayal. Even as I struggled to survive, I couldn't stop thinking about the family I'd lost. I tried, more than once, to reach out, to explain myself, to show that I wasn't the person they thought I was. I wrote letters I never sent, rehearsed phone calls I never made, and even considered showing up at their door, hoping for a shred of understanding. Each attempt ended in disappointment, my words twisted, ignored, or dismissed. It was painful, but it forced me to turn inward, to rely on myself in ways I hadn't before. I began reading anything I could get my hands on, teaching myself skills I had never thought I needed. Budgeting, basic repairs, even public speaking in the quiet of my room. I took on challenges that others might have avoided, small acts that built my confidence piece by piece. Every evening I reflected on what I had learned, writing down ideas, planning the next steps, quietly building a life that my family could never take away again. There were moments of doubt, nights when I wished for the warmth of their approval. But slowly, resilience took root. I began to see patterns in people, situations, and opportunities, understanding that survival required not just strength, but intelligence and foresight. By the time I finally began to feel the first glimmers of stability, I realized that the hardships I endured were teaching me lessons that would shape a life far stronger than the one I'd lost. I carried the secret with me everywhere, a weight that shaped every choice I made, yet it was only in the quiet hours, alone in my small apartment, or walking the empty streets, that I allowed myself to face it fully. I had always feared my father's reaction, feared judgment, rejection, and anger, but now that I had no one to please, I began to understand it on my own terms. The secret wasn't shameful in itself. It was a part of who I was, a truth that clashed with the rigid expectations of the family I had lost. I reflected on the years of anger and abandonment, and for the first time, I realized the injustice wasn't about me being wrong. It was about them being unable to accept difference, unable to embrace complexity. This awareness didn't erase the pain, but it shifted something inside me. I started to see that my value wasn't defined by approval, inheritance, or status. It was defined by my choices, my perseverance, and my integrity. In my solitude, I rehearsed conversations I might have had, imagined confrontations that might never happen, and felt a strange sense of empowerment, as if finally owning my truth gave me a power that no dismissal or betrayal could take away. The secret, once a source of fear, became a symbol of resilience, a quiet ember that would someday ignite the reversal I had long imagined but could not yet reveal. The tension of what could happen if the family ever learned this truth simmered beneath the surface, a promise of payback that would be as satisfying as it was inevitable. For years, I moved quietly, unnoticed, carefully planting the seeds of a life my family would never see coming. I took every opportunity, no matter how small, learning the ins and outs of industries I had only glimpsed before. I stayed late at work, absorbed knowledge from mentors who had no idea of my personal history, and slowly, deliberately, began to carve out a path that would lead me somewhere far from the shadow of my father's anger. The contrast between then and now was staggering, even to myself. The scared, hungry, rejected kid wandering the streets had become someone capable, resourceful, and growing in ways my family could never imagine. I invested wisely, networked subtly, and built a reputation for intelligence and reliability, all while keeping my triumphs quiet. Yet, the thought of my parents' ignorance fueled me as much as the fear of failure. I imagined them dismissing me, assuming I was struggling still, and it stung, but it also lit a quiet fire inside me, a sense of FOMO for them that they couldn't feel yet. Every new opportunity I seized, every skill I mastered, every promotion I earned, became a quiet victory, a reminder that I was no longer the powerless child they had cast aside. And all the while, I prepared for the day when the world they thought I inhabited would collide with the reality I had painstakingly created, a moment that would finally tip the scales in my favor. It happened unexpectedly one afternoon, while I was walking through the downtown streets I had come to know so well. A familiar face emerged from the crowd, a distant cousin I hadn't seen in years, smiling politely but clearly unaware of who I had become. We exchanged small talk, laughter forced yet cordial, and as we spoke, the conversation inevitably drifted to my family. I listened carefully, noting the casual way they mentioned my parents' assumptions, that I was struggling, that I hadn't moved forward, that I remained the same powerless child. My chest tightened with a mix of frustration and anticipation. The contrast between their ignorance and my reality was sharp, almost delicious. Every offhand comment about my supposed hardships reminded me how much they had underestimated me, how blind they were to the quiet transformation I had achieved. I smiled politely, letting them speak, all the while feeling the tension build like a coiled spring. Each word, each assumption, heightened the anticipation of the moment I would finally confront them. I walked away later, heart pounding, thinking about the day I would stand before them not as the rejected child, but as someone entirely untouchable, someone they could no longer ignore or dismiss. The thought of that revelation made my pulse quicken and my resolve deepen. The day I realized my life had truly changed began like any other, but by evening, nothing would ever feel the same. After years of quiet effort, sacrifices, and relentless focus, I received the call confirming my promotion, a title and responsibility far beyond what anyone in my family could have imagined I would achieve. It wasn't just a job advancement. It was a validation of every late night, every rejection, every moment I had spent building myself up when the world had ignored me. I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment, staring at the city skyline, letting the weight of the accomplishment sink in. For the first time, I felt the scales tip. The powerless, discarded child my parents had thrown out now had authority, respect, and influence that they had never anticipated. I thought of them instantly, imagining their continued assumptions about my struggle and obliviousness, and a quiet thrill ran through me. The contrast between then and now was stark, weak versus capable, rejected versus triumphant. I allowed myself a moment to savor the satisfaction, knowing that this milestone wasn't just a personal victory, it was the first taste of the power reversal I had long envisioned. The world was finally seeing me for what I had become, and the knowledge that my family remained ignorant made the moment even sweeter. From here, I knew the trajectory of my life had shifted irreversibly, and the long-awaited reckoning would be all the more satisfying. It wasn't a phone call or a direct message that reached them. It never needed to be. Rumors travel fast, especially when whispered by mutual acquaintances who didn't know the full story. I caught wind of it first through a subtle social media post. But soon enough, friends of my parents began mentioning my achievements, with awe and disbelief in their voices. I could almost see it. My parents' faces, contorted with jealousy, disbelief, and that familiar sense of wounded pride. The family who had dismissed me, deemed me unworthy, now had to reckon with the reality that I had flourished without them. Each passing mention stoked a quiet fury in me, but also anticipation. They had assumed I was lost, weak, and invisible. Instead, I had built a life that surpassed their expectations entirely. The status tension was palpable in my imagination. The old dynamic flipped, the rejected child now standing above those who had tried to keep me down. I smiled, imagining their outrage, their whispers behind closed doors, the questions they couldn't ask me directly. And yet, the best part was that they had no idea how far I had come, no inkling of the full story, no sense of the reckoning that was quietly approaching. I spent hours alone, pacing my apartment, running through every possible scenario in my mind. 15 years of pain, rejection, and silence had taught me one thing. Patience was my greatest weapon. I reminded myself that this wasn't about anger or hasty revenge. It was about control, dignity, and timing. I thought back to the nights I'd spent shivering on friends' couches, the humiliation of being ignored, and the relentless fear of never being accepted. Those wounds still throbbed beneath the surface, but they no longer dictated my actions. I rehearsed my words, measured my tone, and visualized the calm authority I would carry when the family finally stood before me. I imagined their faces, the surprise, the tension, the disbelief, and allowed a quiet satisfaction to settle in. I reflected on the long path that had led me here, the sacrifices, the learning, the quiet victories, and recognized that I had grown not just stronger, but wiser. This encounter wasn't just a confrontation. It was a testament to the life I had built, the respect I had earned, and the resilience that had been forged from every moment of rejection. I would remain composed, observant, and measured, knowing that the real power lay in the way I carried myself. When the time came, I would let the truth speak for itself, and it would speak louder than any words I could utter. The sound of the doorbell made my heart skip a beat, though I had been expecting this day in one form or another for years. I stood quietly, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of every experience that had brought me here. 15 years of silence, of struggle, of growth, all led to this single, electrifying moment. When I opened the door, there they were, my parents, hesitant, stiff, and clearly unsure of what to expect. Their eyes widened, scanning me from head to toe, as if trying to reconcile the person before them with the child they had once cast out. I held their gaze steadily, calm and composed, letting the tension stretch out unbearably. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, disbelief, and the faint sting of their past judgments. My chest tightened with a mix of anticipation and satisfaction. Finally, the dynamic had shifted. I allowed them to take in the scene, every detail of my presence, the quiet confidence that I had cultivated over the years. It wasn't arrogance. It was control, patience, and the quiet power of someone who had endured and risen. Each second stretched longer, building suspense, drawing the confrontation forward, and in that charged silence, I knew the first crack in their assumptions had already begun. This was the moment they would realize how completely they had underestimated me, and I could savor the anticipation of their reaction, knowing the payoff would be worth every hardship endured. I invited them in with a calm smile, gesturing toward the living room I had worked years to furnish with care, elegance, and subtle reminders of the life I had built. The first flicker of shock passed over their faces as their eyes roamed over the art, the carefully curated furniture, the bookshelves stacked with accolades and awards. I offered them drinks, casual and composed, while their expressions betrayed a growing realization. The child they had discarded was no longer powerless. I mentioned a few recent achievements in passing, projects, promotions, investments, watching their forced politeness falter into genuine disbelief. They shifted awkwardly, mumbling empty compliments. But the tension was thick. They could not hide the embarrassment. I had learned to let success speak quietly but forcefully, and every subtle detail of my home, my demeanor, and my confidence reinforced the reversal of power. For years, they had assumed I struggled, that I remained dependent and weak. Now, they were confronted with the undeniable truth that I had not only survived but thrived, far beyond what they could comprehend. I saw the flickers of regret and frustration, the silent questions they dared not voice, and I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. The scales had tipped entirely, and I could finally stand as the one in control, letting them recognize without a word that the past could not touch me anymore. Every glance, every half-smile, every stumble of their composure confirmed the victory I had built piece by piece, silently, for 15 long years. After they left, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, the echoes of their stunned expressions still lingering in my mind. The confrontation had been everything I imagined, yet the satisfaction was not in humiliation or revenge. It was in the calm knowledge of my own strength. 15 years of struggle had taught me resilience, patience, and the value of building a life on my own terms. I reflected on the boy they had cast out, the mistakes, the heartbreak, and the silent sacrifices, and realized that every hardship had shaped me into someone far more capable than I ever could have been otherwise. Forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about freeing myself from the bitterness that could have consumed me. I allowed myself a quiet smile, acknowledging that while the past had been cruel, it had also been necessary. The life I had built, the achievements I had earned, and the respect I had cultivated could never be taken away, and I felt a profound sense of closure. The bitterness of rejection had softened into gratitude for the lessons learned, and the anticipation of the future felt lighter, brighter. I understood that true power wasn't in proving others wrong. It was in knowing my worth, embracing my growth, and carrying forward with dignity and grace. In that moment, I finally felt whole, tempered by struggle but unbroken, ready for whatever life would bring next. Sitting alone in the quiet after everything had settled, I let myself breathe for the first time in years. The confrontation was over. The family had seen the truth, and yet the satisfaction I felt wasn't rooted in their shock or embarrassment. It was in me, in what I had become. 15 years of rejection, struggle, and sacrifice had shaped me into someone stronger, wiser, and more self-aware than I could have imagined. I thought back to the nights I cried alone, the hunger, the humiliation, and even the moments of doubt, and I realized that each had been a stepping stone, molding resilience and patience into something invaluable. Forgiveness didn't come because they deserved it. It came because I no longer wanted to carry the weight of anger or resentment. The life I had built, quietly, carefully, was mine, and the lessons I learned about self-worth, perseverance, and the subtle power of patience were priceless. There was a bitter sweetness to it all, a recognition that while the past had been painful, it had been necessary to create the present. I smiled softly, knowing I had not only survived but grown, and that the story of who I was, once cast aside, was now a testament to endurance, wisdom, and quiet triumph. In that calm, reflective moment, I felt a sense of closure I had never imagined possible. Just as I thought the encounter had reached its peak, I revealed the final detail I had kept hidden all these years. My parents' expressions shifted instantly, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a tiny spark of envy flashing across their faces. The life I had built wasn't just comfortable or successful. It exceeded even the wildest assumptions they could have made. Investments, properties, and connections they hadn't imagined were quietly mine, each one a testament to the perseverance and ingenuity they had never recognized. I watched them scramble mentally, trying to process the reality that the child they had discarded had quietly become someone untouchable. I said nothing, letting their imagination do the work, letting the weight of their assumptions crumble under the truth. The silence was thick, but it spoke volumes, leaving them to wonder what else I might have achieved while they were blind to my growth. In that quiet, subtle moment, I felt the final satisfaction of my journey. Vindication not in confrontation, but in the undeniable, unspoken proof that I had risen far beyond anyone's expectations. And as they left, the lingering shock on their faces reminded me that some victories are sweetest when quietly observed, leaving a trace of FOMO that would echo long after the door closed.